Good evening and welcome to our last section of notes on the American Revolution. Tonight is The War Ends. How did the Americans win the war? So we're picking up after the Battle of Saratoga and foreign help. And if you remember, after the Battle of Saratoga, the British pretty much abandoned the New England region. As they were not able to cut the New England region off, Americans win the Battle of Saratoga, so they move south, move into the Carolinas and Virginia, and focus their attention there. This is in 1778, that next year, when it shifted down. Notice this, the British hoped to gain support of the Loyalists. If you remember from the study guide, one of the keys to victory was that the British were not able to fully utilize the Loyalists. The Loyalists don't join in the fighting as much. They just want to stay loyal, but they're not willing to help in the fighting like the rebels and the patriots are against the British. With the shift to the south, the Americans are losing battle after battle. And even after this turning point at Saratoga, it's not looking very good for the Americans as they just continually lose battles. A little bit later, summer of 1780, one of the Americans' best military people, Benedict Arnold, gets mad at the Americans. He didn't get a promotion. He's not receiving the credit for the successes that he had. So he becomes a traitor. He decides to try to hand over the American fort at West Point to the British. The Americans find out about it and stop it. However, Benedict Arnold sneaks out and joins the British for the last few years of the war. By the fall of 1780, the tide finally starts to turn for the best for the Americans in the South. Patriots organize hit-and-run tactics. They hide behind trees, they hide behind walls, they shoot and they run. Similar to what we saw at the Battle of Lexington and Concord when the British were marching back to Boston. We now see this as a common attack tactic in the South. These are used throughout the South, leads to victories, and force General Cornwallis, who is the British general, out of the Carolinas, and it forces him into Virginia. General Cornwallis goes to an area in Virginia called Yorktown, which is on a peninsula. They camp here. It's easy to get supplies in and out of the region. They can bring boats up to the shore, bring food, bring ammunition, bring guns or cannons. However, Washington and troops seal off the land. They surround him by land, and he's not able to escape by land. If you remember from Saratoga, after the Battle of Saratoga, the French decide to join us. And one of the key reasons the Americans wanted the French is the French had an awesome navy. So the French Navy comes to Yorktown, and they trap the British by sea. So now the British cannot escape by land, they cannot escape by sea, and they are stuck at Yorktown. Cornwallis holds out for 3 weeks, hoping to figure out a way to escape. However, he finally surrenders on October 19th, 1781. This pretty much ends the American Revolution. The Americans win as they force the top general of the British to surrender his military. It won't be for another 2 years, though, before it officially ends and a peace treaty signed. The peace treaty that's signed is called the Treaty of Paris, the 1783 Treaty of Paris, as there was also a Treaty of Paris to end the French and Indian War in 1763. Some agreements that came out of the Treaty of Paris was, one, most important, the U.S. was an independent nation, or the U.S. is an independent nation. It sets the boundaries for the U.S. at the Mississippi River to the west, Canada to the north, and Florida to the south. So it makes America, or gives America, all of British land south of Canada. It allows Americans to fish off the coast of Canada in the Atlantic Ocean, which provides economic resources for the Americans. It's agreed that each side would repay all debts. However, this doesn't actually happen. The British would return any enslaved persons they had captured. So any prisoners of war that the British had captured during the war were to be returned to the Americans. And then Congress would recommend that states return any property taken from Loyalists. The key part of that is recommend. It wasn't a requirement. And for the most part, Loyalists did not get their property back. In an overview, the war lasted about 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. The Americans, or the Patriots, lost about 26,000 Americans, and another 8,000 were wounded, or a little over 8,000 were wounded. The British only lost 10,000 people. If you look at those numbers, you would think, oh, British probably won. The British, though, if you remember, were fighting 3,000 miles away from home. An 8-year war is a long, long war. And the people in Britain are starting to wonder, why are we fighting this war 3,000 miles from home with land that's not going to really impact the average British citizen? During and shortly after the war, about 60 to 100,000 Loyalists left the country. Most of them went up to Canada. Canada is still under British control at this time. And another lasting impact was Congress had borrowed $27 million for the war. This is equal to about $13 billion today, $14 billion today, that they would have to pay back. So, as you see, and as you look back over all of the war that we have discussed over the last month, the Americans were on the run for much of the war. However, they had key turning points and key events that kept them going, kept them motivated just long enough to wear out the British and eventually lead to the surrender at Yorktown. We will finish up discussion of the American Revolution tomorrow, and we will begin our unit project shortly and some review for our unit test. Remember, you have a study guide. I would recommend taking some notes on the back of that study guide to help remember some of the key events and key information of each of the topics. Have a good evening.